I really appreciate that you guys invited me here because I am very much a technophobe. And all my journalism career, I reported by gathering information firsthand. I gathered information from my reporting by talking to people, by going out, by watching things, by observing things. I did a little bit of research, but not very much. But when I started to write my book, that's when I realized how important archives were, and records, and history, and I really had to delve into the whole area of trying to basically search and find out information. And partly it was because I was doing a history story, a history book, and I wanted to recreate a world that no longer existed, and I wanted to do it and tell the story through people. And it was through archives that I was able, for the most part, to get most of my information. So I wanted to talk about my story, Carville's Cure, and why I wrote the story, what the story is, and then where I got my information in my effort to basically recreate a world that existed 150 years ago. Okay. So first of all, I just want to talk a little bit about how the story got started. Does anybody here, how many people here actually know about Carville and what the story is? Okay, so about half of you, I would say. A lot of people do not know, even people who live in Louisiana or who have lived here all their lives don't know this story. And many, many, many Americans have never heard this story. And the way we found out about it was personal. So this picture up here, this man on the right, his name is Morris Cole, and he is my husband's grandfather, and that little boy there is his father. And this picture was taken in the early 1930s. In 1998, my father-in-law, Harold Cole, the little boy there, called us up one day and said, I have something I need to tell you. I've been keeping something a secret for, at this point, it was more than 60 years. He said, when I was a little boy, when I went to school one day, I came home and my father was gone. And he had been taken by the Public Health Service down to some hospital in the South, he had no idea where, and he never saw his father again. And he knew his father had leprosy, but he didn't know what happened to him. And his mother told him, don't ever tell anybody that your father had leprosy because it will destroy the family, because the stigma was so great for this disease. So he hadn't told anybody for more than 60 years. And then when he was an older man, he just decided, I have to reveal what happened and try and find out what happened to my father. So we did research and discovered that the US government ran a hospital in Carville, Louisiana, where for many, many years, mostly through the beginning of the 20th century, anybody in the country who was diagnosed with this disease was taken and brought to this hospital and confined there, some of them for the rest of their lives. So we did this research and oh my goodness, this hospital exists, and it was still functioning at the time in 1998. So we went and took my father-in-law down to visit, and this is, have any of you been there before? So just a couple, okay. It's right down the street here. I mean, it's about 15 miles from here. It's along the River Road in Carville, and it was basically an old plantation that was taken over first by the state and then by the US government and turned into this hospital. And that is the main administration building, which obviously was the plantation house. It's actually quite beautiful. There's these long corridors where the patients were able to go from one facility to another. There were lots of dorms. And this, believe it or not, is what it looked like, probably at its height, So these were all dorms for all the patients. And the place was surrounded by a fence because the patients were not allowed to leave, for much of the 21st century. And there's actually a cemetery in the back, and many of the patients died and were buried there. My father-in-law's father actually was buried in a Jewish cemetery here in Baton Rouge. He died at Carville, and because he was Jewish, he was buried in this other cemetery. He died there in about 1930. So anyway, we brought my father-in-law down to see this facility. And there were actually still patients there at the time. This is in 1998. But mostly they were people who had lived there all their lives and they had nowhere else to go. And that's actually my father-in-law we went to visit. So when we went to visit, I saw, this is like an amazing story, that these thousands of Americans were taken away from their families. They were isolated in this facility, in some cases thousands of miles from their homes. Many of the patients were told to change their names, as my father-in-law's father did, because the stigma of this disease was so great that it was believed that it would bring embarrassment and shame to your family. So the other thing I found out when we went there started doing some research is that this disease is one of the least contagious diseases there is. 95% of the human race cannot get leprosy. And the other 5%, you can only get it by long-term sustained contact. So here we had the US federal government isolating these patients for a disease that was not that contagious. And it was all because of the stigma and the ignorance about this disease. And these people's lives, a lot of them that were totally destroyed. I saw the impact that it had had on my father-in-law, who lost his father as a little boy. And he became a very insecure person all of his life, my father-in-law, because he had this secret that he kept inside him. So that's when I decided I need to write this story, because people just don't know what the government did. And so that's when I started deciding, okay, I have to write this book. Again, my big challenge was most of the people involved had died. So I needed to recreate this world. How was I going to go about doing it? And again, as I say, as a journalist, I did everything much more firsthand. Now I had this whole new experience. I had some records from my father-in-law's father. I'm going to call him Morris Krug, so I don't have to keep Cole, so I don't have to. I said Krug because that was the alias he adopted when he went to Carville. But I'll say Morris Cole, so I don't have to keep saying my father-in-law's father. Anyway, so we had some of his records, but very, 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 very minimal records at Carville. This is like his whole clinical record for the 3 years that he was there. It talks about when he first started feeling the disease. He started with some numbness in his hand. He started getting worse. He started getting eye trouble later on. He finally became blind, which is when he was actually brought to Carville. But one thing he does say in this medical record, he talks about, and this is a little bit more of a talk, he talks about when he first found out that he had this disease, his initial reaction was to kill himself. Because at the time, again, he knew that the stigma was so great. You know, how are people going to treat him? But then he looked at his little children and he decided not to kill himself. And one thing he did, he lived in Connecticut at the time, and one thing he did, there was one state in the country that did not automatically send their patients to Carville, and that was New York. So in the middle of the night, he took all of his stuff, he fled Connecticut, and he moved to New York so he could live there for a while until he got really bad and was taken by the Public Health Service. So anyway, I didn't really have much information from him. One of the things I did do, there were actually some patients, as I mentioned in 1998, who were still living at Carville. When I started working on the book in 2015, there were also about 10 patients that the federal government was still caring for. No longer were people required to go to Carville, but again, some of these patients had spent decades there, and they really had nowhere else to go, even after they had been cured of the disease. So the federal government took care of them, and a number of them, when I started working on the book, were in a nursing home here in Baton Rouge. The last person actually just died last year, but there were about 10 there, and I interviewed all of them, including this man, Daniel Cabrera, who came to Carville when he was like in the 1950s, and he died still under government care in 2018 while I was working on the book. And he told me he never told his family. He was initially from Mexico, had come to the United States. He never told his family back in Mexico that he had leprosy because he was so ashamed of it. So they thought he was just up here working and sending them money. And I met his son right before he died. He reconnected with his son in Mexico, who was 71 years old and just found out that his father, a few months before his father died, came up here and found out that his father had been suffering from leprosy, and that was the reason that he was away from home for all those years. So it's very similar to ours, it was a family secret. Again, another family ripped apart because of this disease. The other thing I did, I was able to get a lot of records at the LSU archives. So LSU, in your special collections, if you don't know, you have wonderful archives of the creation of Carville. And this in the special collections. Before the federal government took over, it was called the Louisiana Leper Home. And it was started by the state because there was more leprosy in this area, in Louisiana, Mississippi, Texas, and Florida than the rest of the country. So there was a lot of pressure in the late 1800s to do something with these patients, because this was a time when people were starting to worry about germs and disease. They were worrying a lot about foreigners coming in and immigrants bringing in all these diseases. So there was a lot of hysteria. But anyway, so the state of Louisiana set up this home to try and treat the patients and, quite frankly, just isolate them and get them away from New Orleans, mostly. This is a letter, I just put this one up here because this is a letter from the locals in Carville, in the area, complaining to the state about some of the patients leaving the grounds and touching their crops, and their fear that they were spreading the disease. They say, we understand their lot in life at best is indeed sad, but on the other hand, can we afford to take chances of contracting this disease and leave such a legacy to our generations? We sincerely hope that you will see that these evils are reconsidered at once. They just wanted to make sure that the patients were kept behind that fence. One of the people who signed this letter is Louis Carville, and he was the postmaster and James Carville's grandfather, and who obviously the town was eventually named after. Anyway, you guys had great records, all on paper though, so I had to physically go there and get them. I also was able to get a lot of information from the newspapers. Newspapers were covering the whole issue of disease and leprosy quite extensively, especially in this area in the late 1800s. I just put up this picture of this reporter. He worked for the Daily Picayune. He became their leprosy reporter. His name is John Smith Kendall. And a lot of the stories he wrote basically drummed up public hysteria in the 1880s about the disease. Why are these people allowed to walk around? This is before the leper home was started. Why are they allowed to walk through the streets of New Orleans? They're going to spread this terrible disease. So it was partly his stories that led to the public pressure to create this, this leprosarium. And I only put this up because the coverage of leprosy was really over the top. And this was, I love this headline, U.S. to frustrate escape of lepers. Once the place got started, the hospital got started, there was a fear, there were rumors around that some of the patients were going to try and escape and go to Washington, D.C. to ask for more freedom and better care. And so this was a big headline. There was like this terrible fear that the patients were going to actually escape from Carville and come up to Washington, D.C. and invade the city. And they actually had guards around the city to protect against all the leprosy patients. I mean, it's sort of bizarre. Anyway, so most of the newspaper coverage that I relied on, a lot of it was really sensational and quite frankly inaccurate, which was pretty disturbing for me as a journalist to realize how inaccurate it was. But it was important for to help create the environment that Carville was in and what these patients and their families had to deal with. The other thing that I was able to use a lot of when I was writing the book is patient memoirs. So a lot of the patients weren't even that sick, okay? So somebody might have been diagnosed with leprosy, they might have had one little mark on their skin, and a doctor would say, oh, you have leprosy, it looks like you have leprosy. They would get sent to Carville, and they didn't really get that sick. Some people really, it didn't develop that much, and they didn't get sick. So you had people in this hospital who were young and healthy and smart and active, and they wanted to create a life for themselves, obviously, in this place. And they got very involved in activities there, especially after the federal government took over. And a lot of them ended up writing, or not a lot of them, but several wrote memoirs, which were just really very beautifully written. There's a woman named Betty Martin who was a debutante in New Orleans, and she was 19 years old when she was diagnosed, and she was sent to Carville. And she has this beautiful memoir that she wrote called Miracle at Carville. And it was really wonderful for me to be able to read these memoirs. And this one, I put this guy here. His name is John Early. And he was diagnosed with leprosy when he was visiting Washington, D.C. This was actually in 1908. He went to pick up he was a Spanish-American War veteran. He had gone there to pick up his pension, and he had some rash. So he went to the doctor and said, doctor, what is this? And he joked. He said, what do I have, leprosy? Ha, ha, ha. So the doctors freaked out. They took him from his hotel with all of his belongings, and they stuck him in this isolation tent along the edge of the Potomac River, where he stayed for 6 months because they couldn't figure out what to do with him. Louisiana had the Louisiana Leper Home, but there was no national hospital yet. And it was the story of John Early that eventually led to the Public Health Service coming down here and taking over Carville and making it a national leprosarium. After Congress, everybody was so freaked out about this man with leprosy being in Washington, D.C., that Congress passed a law saying, okay, if you have leprosy, if you're diagnosed, we're going to create this national leprosarium, and we're going to make people go and be confined. So it's because of John Early that my father-in-law's father ended up down here. But John Early also wrote a memoir, which I was able to use, which was great. And it was just a handwritten, not handwritten, it was typed memoir that he wrote when he finally ended up coming down and being confined at Carville. And he used to escape all the time. And when you escaped from Carville, if you got caught, they actually had a jail inside Carville to punish the patients if they escaped. And he wrote his memoir while he was in jail in Carville, believe it or not. So that actually gave me a lot of information. I got a lot of information from this family. This is the Landry family from Lafayette. And that's the parents with their 5 children. All 5 of those children ended up being contracting leprosy, being sent to Carville, and living out the rest of their lives there. So over a period of about 60 years, some Landry, one of those Landrys, was a patient at Carville. They all died there, and quite frankly, they all died of things other than leprosy. That was sort of another misperception about the disease. You don't die from leprosy. It causes other like organ problems over years, but it takes decades, quite frankly, if you are going to die from one of those illnesses. Anyway, so they also had, they have a whole record of letters that the family wrote, as the patients wrote back to their spouses or other family members, another gold mine of information. Again, all of this is on paper, though. None of this is digital. I just put this one letter that Edmund wrote to his wife. That was the oldest son who was at Carville. And this is it's April 28th, 1927. And these are in the University in Lafayette, these records. And this was on the eve of the Great Mississippi Flood of 1927. And he was talking about how everybody at the hospital was worried about the flood coming, and that if the flood did come, that nobody would come and rescue them because they were leprosy patients. And he wrote, I never liked levees anyway, and now being a leper, I wondered just how much rescue help would come to us in distress. And as close as I can figure it, the majority will say, let them drown. It's good riddance. And the value of this is all of this just shows the emotion and what these people were going through and why, and basically kind of the hatred that they had to deal with and why they were confined. And these patients basically knew that leprosy was not that contagious because nobody who worked at the hospital ever contracted it. So they knew that they were unfairly being confined because of the stigma of this disease. And all of that stuff was captured through a lot of these documents that I was able to get. Let me just go, that's the letters. Now the other archive I was able to use, the Daughters of Charity were the nurses at Carville. Neither the state, when it was the Louisiana Leper Home, or the US federal government, when they took over, were able to get anybody else to come and be nurses at this hospital. Again, because of the stigma and misunderstanding about the disease. They were able to get the Daughters of Charity to come. So those nurses, those sisters came, were here, and they basically ran the place. But they also happened to be amazing archivists and record keepers. They kept annals of all of the daily records. I put this one here, May 27th, this is 1935. It says 12 patients have arrived in the past few days, 4 from New York, 1 a native of Greece, and 1 of Russia. That 1 of Russia is my father-in-law's father. So when I was in their archives and I found this, I was like, oh my gosh, this is amazing. Anyway, so they kept wonderful archives. So that was of great value for me to try and recreate this world. I was also able to use archives from the National Library of Medicine, Library of Congress. There's also, the sisters also took tons of photos. This is a picture of a little boy who was a patient at Carville at a 4th of July picnic that they had. There's also now a museum at Carville. it's no longer a hospital. It's a Louisiana National Guard facility. But there is a museum on the grounds. They have amazing archives, which I was also able to use with a lot of the artifacts about the patients, and amazing photos of, this is what that plantation house looked like when the patients first arrived there. So as you can see, these patients were basically being tossed away by society. You know, get them away from here, get them away, just isolate them everywhere, and eventually it got built up into, you know, a functioning hospital. And then these are some other photos that are at the archives at Carville. They used to have Mardi Gras, you know, because it became the patient's world. This was their world inside. And, you know, there were young people, there were older people. People fell in love there. They weren't allowed to marry. You weren't really supposed to intermingle, but of course they did. And, but they had a whole world there. So they did Mardi Gras parades. They had sporting teams. They had schools for the children. They had dances. They had a little bar there. One of the amazing things that I found during the coverage of reporting on this and trying to get information from my book was that it was an incredibly integrated community. When we were talking about southern Louisiana in the 1930s, 1940s, and 1950s, but the patients were very integrated. You know, the housing was integrated, the sports teams were integrated, the school was, because in a sense they shared the bond of the discrimination that they had from the outside world because of their disease. But the best piece of place that I got information from was the Star, which is the patient's newspaper. So the patients decided around the early 1940s that they wanted to have a newspaper. And it was started by this man, he's a patient, Stanley Stein, who had always wanted to be a journalist. And the paper started out being just sort of an in-house, what you would expect for a hospital with patients had a newspaper, that it would be just, you know, what they were having for dinner in the cafeteria, who was visiting whom. Eventually, this newspaper, which came out once a month, became a megaphone for the patients to start fighting back for their rights. They started writing articles questioning why they were being confined here in this hospital just because they were sick. They also covered all of the activities. They covered what research was going on around the world into trying to find a cure for leprosy, a lot of it actually which was happening there at Carville. So it became quite a prominent publication. And eventually, it started getting subscriptions outside of Carville around the country and the world. It actually got up to a subscription of about 80,000 a month, which is extraordinary. Anyway, you guys have put the Star online. So the Louisiana Digital Libraries have every issue of the Star online. And this was a gold mine for me, because I could sit in my house in Maryland and do tons and tons of research. And it was this publication that I think more than anything captured what to me is my favorite part of the story, which is the patients fighting back. Because this became, the patients at Carville probably started one of the first patient advocacy movements in this country. So they started fighting to no longer be confined. Like, why are we being treated like this? Just because we were sick, we know the disease is not contagious. They hired lobbyists, they hired lawyers, they started working with the other media, and this was the megaphone for them to get their message out. So this is, if you haven't seen it, this is what it looks like. Again, you guys have all of the, every single issue there. And I can just, search almost any term that I wanted to. I often would search just the name of one of the patients. There were some of the patients who were incredibly active. And I would know, from some of the memoirs, I would have heard that, or from some of the newspaper coverage, I would have heard that something specific had happened, and I could go back to this newspaper and retrieve it and just find out the exact thing. So one of the things I put in here, I just did one search for this woman named Gertrude Hornbostel, who became a patient there after World War II. And she and her husband had both been confined by the Japanese in the Philippines during World War II. When they were released and came back to the United States, she was diagnosed with leprosy. And then they were told that she had to be sent to Carville. And she and her husband put up a huge stink. And it became a national story in 1946. Like, why is my wife being taken from her home in California and brought down to this hospital? So the Hornbostels, they became some of the biggest advocates for winning back the freedom of these patients. So when they get there in 1946, her husband says, I want to come and live with my wife at Carville. The government wouldn't let him, but they let him live down the street and visit her every day. Well, when she gets there, one of the things she finds out, the patients at Carville, besides losing their freedom, their identities, their names, their families, their community, they also lost the right to vote. Because the state of Louisiana had a law that people who were confined in the state could not vote. And that included people who were confined at the leprosy hospital. So when the Hornbostels came down there, and he was a war hero, and they found out that his wife was going to lose her right to vote, they went to the newspapers, and it became, again, a huge story. And because of the absurdity of patients, some of whom were veterans, some of whom, like my father-in-law's father, who had contracted the disease probably when he was serving in the Philippines, in the service of his country, was taken from his home, brought to this hospital, and lost the right to vote. After that big stink, the state of Louisiana changed the law, and they finally regained the right to vote. Then what happened? Once the patients got the right to vote, the politicians started caring about them. And people who were running for Congress or for local elections in Louisiana started to visit the hospital and started to hear about the patients' concerns. And these patients voted. They voted, 90% turnover. Once they started voting and had the right to vote, they started having influence. And all of this stuff, I was able to get, a lot of this stuff, not only from the memoirs and the other archives, but a lot of it was from the things that were written in the Star that are in your digital archives. This is an article that Gertrude Hornbostel wrote. Her big thing is that the federal government and health officials, instead of confining leprosy patients because everybody was afraid of them, that they should be out there, instead of confining them, educating the public about the fact that the disease was not that contagious, which many doctors knew. And she said that by isolating patients, that the government keeps alive the fear and horror, which they should be the first ones to help dispel. If it were not for segregation, many more patients than are here now would be willing to report for treatment, but they can't get the treatment unless they are willing to come to Carville and be separated from their families, their friends, their homes, and their freedom. So the whole story of what happened at Carville was told, a lot of it through the Star, much of which I could get online. And these are just more. This is just sort of one of the last things I found in the Star. The federal government eventually decided in the 1970s, 1980s, after there was a cure found at Carville for leprosy, that patients should no longer have to come there, and that the federal government should really shut the place down because we were spending a lot of money housing and treating these patients. Well, guess what? Then the patients decided to protest and say, no, wait a second. You took us away from our home initially. You confined us here. Now you want us to just leave? Where are we going to go? We have no family. We have no jobs. We're old. You need to take care of us for the rest of our lives. And they protested again, also covered in the Star. It was covered by the local media here as well. This I got off of your website. Eventually the government caved. And that's why there were still patients there when we came to visit in 1998. And the last patient left Carville actually in 2015. At that point, they, were free to come and go, but they were able to live there for the rest of their life, and basically the government took care of them. So anyway, I guess I just really want to emphasize just how important it was that all of these records were still available for me to do this book. And I think that's especially true for this particular story, and also probably similar stories in which the whole purpose of Carville was to basically take these people who had this disease that people feared and misunderstood, to confine them, and quite frankly, to get them out of the way. And I think society just really kind of wanted to forget about them, and that hope that the problem would go away. And many of these families, they kept this a secret. So the value of this information that you help store and preserve is that these things can't be kept secret. That people like me or others can uncover the secrets, can write about them, and to keep these stories alive. And hopefully we as a society will learn something from some of these past mistakes. I cannot tell you, after my book came out, how many people contacted me whose relatives were at this hospital, or who they themselves were at this hospital, and said, thank you so much for telling this story, because I feel like now maybe we'll be remembered. So thank you very much for all the work that you guys do, and please keep it up. I appreciate it.